The top story, Anne-Marie, as you say, it's really important because we are closer to advancing President Biden's ambitious legislative agenda. Democrats are saying that they are closer because of this major budget plan. So here are the numbers. $3.5 trillion that would expand Medicare, address climate change, and focus on other progressive priorities. The top Democrats touted the blueprint, saying they're prepared to pass the bill without any Republican support. Listen.
Every major program that President Biden has asked us for is funded in a robust way. And in addition, we are making some additions to that. Most important, something that Senator Sanders has led and convinced America is so important, which is a robust expansion of Medicare.
For a very long time, the American people have seen the very rich getting richer and government developing policies which allow them to pay, in some cases, not a nickel in federal income taxes. They've seen corporations make huge profits. In some cases, they're not paying a nickel in taxes. And what this legislation says, among many, many other things, that those days are gone.
Now, this all comes as President Biden continues his administration's focus on protecting voting rights. He slammed GOP-led states for introducing restrictions and changes to election laws across the country during a major speech yesterday. Ed O'Keefe takes a closer look.
21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting, and we're going to challenge it vigorously.
Speaking from Philadelphia, the birthplace of American democracy, President Biden forcefully attacked voting restrictions being enacted in more than a dozen GOP-controlled states.
Stand up for God's sake and help prevent this concerted effort to undermine our election and the sacred right to vote. Have you no shame?
The White House hopes the president's speech will jumpstart a push for new federal voting rights legislation. But the bills he wants passed can't clear the closely divided Senate unless it abolishes the filibuster. The president also directly addressed unfounded accusations embraced by former President Trump that Democrats stole last year's presidential election.
The big lie is just that, a big lie.
The speech came as more than 50 Democratic state lawmakers left Texas in order to stop debate on GOP elections law changes.
The motion fails for lack of quorum.
They spent their first full day in Washington pushing the Senate to pass voting rights legislation.
We're just hoping to move the needle a little bit more. We're hoping that Congress would understand the urgency.
This is about Americans.
The group met with Vice President Harris and supportive Senate Democrats.
What's happening in Texas by the GOP legislators and governor is just outrageous.
But Republicans continue to dismiss their D.C. trip as a political stunt.
It's disingenuous and downright false to claim that any effort to prevent fraud is a veiled attempt at voter suppression.
And while Texas's governor threatened to arrest the Democrats, they said they're not concerned.
We would not go to jail.
So Ed O'Keefe is joining us now from the White House. Ed, let's start with President Biden's push to address voting rights. We saw in your piece that, there's not a lot the federal government can do unless Congress eliminates the filibuster. So then the question is, where do things stand on that right now, the elimination or modification of the filibuster?
Well, and actually we should point out there is one thing the federal government could do. If there were enough members of the right party in place to pass that bill, it could get through the Senate. So it's a reminder that elections have consequences. But when it comes to the current situation where we've got 50 members of both caucuses and no agreement on this issue, there is, of course, continued pressure, as there has been since he took office, on the president to support carving out or completely eliminating the filibuster so that Democrats could pass federal voting rights legislation, be it the For the People Act or the John Lewis Act, two different bills that would essentially address a lot of these concerns. So, for now, there are said to be bipartisan talks that continue on this issue, as there are on many other issues, to see if at some point there could be a breakthrough, at least on something modest, to address concerns with elections laws across the country. But as long as you've got Republicans opposed and probably as many as 5 moderate Democrats concerned about that legislation right now, or aspects of it, it's going to be very difficult to get it through. It's not just Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema of West Virginia and Arizona. You dive deeper into this, and you probably have concerns from John Tester of Montana, Angus King, the independent from Maine, possibly Jackie Rosen of Nevada, and maybe even Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire. And the concern would be the fact that this bill would essentially mandate blanket procedures and programs across the country that critics say gets a little too into state control of elections, which is explicitly called out in the Constitution.
So, and as we also mentioned, let's talk about the Democrats and their unveiling of their new budget bill that addresses much of what President Biden called human infrastructure priorities. So break down for our viewers what exactly is in this proposal.
So it's a $3.5 trillion proposal, and we should keep calling it that until it becomes law, if it becomes law. It includes more funding for child care programs. It would expand Medicare. It would aggressively address, in the eyes of Democrats, the concerns about climate change. It is also, they say, paid for, and not with new taxes. That is designed to bring along those moderates, again, who may be concerned about the size and scope of legislation, and in this case, the price. It is far less, however, than the proposed $6 trillion plan from Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who is the chair of the Budget Committee, but who stood alongside Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer last night when they unveiled this. Democrats want to have what they call a unity budget plan that will get all 50 of them plus Vice President Harris on board so that they can use that another procedural tactic known as reconciliation, which allows senators to pass a budget bill with a simple majority vote. Given that this $3.5 trillion plan is unlikely to get any Republican support, they've got to have all 51 of those Democrats in the Senate on board. The president is going to lunch today with them up at the Capitol, returning to his old stomping grounds to begin what I'm calling the arm-twisting stage of his presidency. He's got to go in there now and sell this alongside Democratic leaders and say, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, any of you others who may have concerns with this, you got to get on board. This is a partisan priority of ours. We promised this in the elections. I want to see get it done. Then, of course, and I know you have questions about this, there's that bipartisan budget plan.
Yeah, so then what is going on with that?
Talks on that continue as well. And the hope is to have some kind of a blueprint either later this week or next week. Remember, this is the deal that was cut by 5 Democrats in the Senate, 5 Republicans in the Senate. They came over here to the White House. They stood right out here on the driveway with the president and said, we have a deal. The problem is they got to find at least 5 more Republicans. And once again, make sure that all Democrats are on board. You got to do the math. And thankfully, it's split 50-50, so it's pretty easy to do it these days. This one, of course, $579 billion in new spending, and this is the more traditional infrastructure spending. Roads, bridges, rails, tunnels, ports would reprogram or repurpose some of the money that's been already authorized through COVID-19 relief bills in the past year or so. And as it says there, would not raise taxes on either wealthy Americans or corporations, which was a Democratic priority, but given the split nature of the Senate, isn't something that can be done. So talks continue, and we've said this before, we'll say it again. As long as they're talking, things are moving in the right direction. This is a president who likes to give them the time and space to do that. There's no deadline on these things, so this could go on for a few more weeks, maybe a few more months. But in the view of this White House, as long as the talking continues, that's progress.
So, Ed, how will this, we talked about this bipartisan infrastructure deal that's being negotiated in the Senate now, but if Democrats use reconciliation to push the budget through, how will this, I mean, we already know how Republicans will react to this. Can you give us maybe this is maybe getting in the weeds, but how should our viewers think about reconciliation and how it's been used in the past? Let's talk about that.
We're getting in the weeds? This is what we do on CBSN. This is why we have CBSN.
I love it.
It's okay.
I don't like throwing curveballs, but I'm just intrigued by this reconciliation process.
Yeah. So again, this isn't the Catholic sacrament. This is a Senate procedural tool, and it's designed to allow the party in charge to pass a budget plan, a spending bill, with a simple majority. Because normally, as everyone who follows the filibuster fight at least knows, you got to get 60 votes at least to get legislation through. It's been used by Republicans. It's been used by Democrats at different times to get their priorities. And what's going on right now here in town, you hear a lot of talk about the dual-track strategy. That you've got this partisan bill, which is far more expensive and includes all those priorities that the president and many Democrats are pushing for. But then you've got that bipartisan, more traditional infrastructure spending plan, which addresses all those big-ticket items that members of both parties have been saying for about a decade need to be paid for, so that airports and bridges and roads and water systems and electrical grids can get rebuilt or revitalized, and in the view of Democrats, can be electrified or greened to address climate change, and they do that with federal spending. And so you're kind of in the midst of a legislative staring contest because you've got the Democratic plan. By the end of this week, the White House and Democratic leaders would like to know that all 50 members are on board. And so they'll be able to go, okay, that one's ready to go. Where are we on the bipartisan one? Well, that's going to be trickier because Republicans are going to read through what's in this $3.5 trillion plan, and they know that that can pass with just Democrats alone. So they don't want to necessarily be part of some arrangement where, yeah, all this critical spending on infrastructure is being done, but it's part of essentially a strategy to get Democrats a big win and one of their big priorities off the to-do list. So there's a very difficult balancing act that has to go on that I would argue is actually trickier right now among fellow Democrats because of the sensitivities that some of them have to how Republicans will react, when at the end of the day, spending money on traditional infrastructure plans is something that both parties agree on and that voters back home are going to be happy about once they see the local highway or the airport getting rebuilt, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Because remember, we've talked about this too, that rescue plan that was passed earlier this year, that had billions of dollars in relief for cities and states. There have been Republicans who voted against it going home and talking about how great it is that the federal government is spending all this money on them. So eventually, you know, they're still convinced here at the White House that these bills will get through, but it's going to be messy. And that's the traditional legislative process that we haven't seen much of here in Washington in recent years. And it continues. We'll see how it goes.
Well, we'll see, you know, with regards to how messy it gets, President Biden, in his speeches to the American people before he was elected, talked about his experience in these sort of messy battles. So we'll see, we'll finally get that put to the test in the days and weeks ahead. Ed O'Keefe, for us at the White House, my friend, as always, thank you.
Happy to dive into the weeds anytime.
All right, make sure we do that. We make sure you're our walking weed whacker, Ed.
There you go.
I was going to say that.
It's because we're like this,
I was thinking, like, what's another word for that? But you beat me to it. That's great.
They should just have you on the White House lawn, Ed, every time, instead of those contraptions we're always hearing in our live shots. Thank you, my friend.